Cokinos. The Earth's Edge Poetry of Spaceflight.
Thank you very much. Welcome to the end of the day, y'all. Thank you. Applause. Awesome, awesome, awesome. And the PowerPoint's working, so I could just walk away. Everything's good. So my name is Chris Cokinos. I am a professor of English at the University of Arizona, although, as I think I said, this was my last week teaching, so I'm celebrating my retirement with you guys, so thank you. Taught creative writing, science communication, and history of science fiction. So that was actually kind of fun. I have been an analog astronaut. I was at MDRS in 2014. Kai and I chatted about that when I met him earlier this year. And I want to thank you for reminding me of this conference. I don't think I would be here were it not for Kai. And I've also been to Antarctica. I spent a month living in a tent, collecting meteorites with the Antarctic Search for Meteorites for my book, The Fallen Sky. So that, I guess, counts as an analog experience. It felt like another planet. And I've written several books. I've got some back there if you're interested, including this one, Beyond Earth's Edge, The Poetry of Spaceflight. And I just want to say a little bit about that. But first I want to thank the volunteers. I want to thank the organizers. I also want to acknowledge and thank the staff at Biosphere 2, the people who are cleaning up after us, the people who are feeding us. So a round of applause, please. Thank you for that labor, which is important. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about the origin of this book and read just a couple little sections that kind of set it up. It is a collection of poetry. I have one poem in there, but it's a span of poetry. And I'll say a little bit more about how it's organized. And then you're going to hear from poets. You're going to see some poets reading their own work. I'm going to read some work by other poets. And if you'll indulge me at the end, I'm going to read a poem of my own. A different poem, not the one that's in this book. So that's the game plan, so you know where we are at any given point. So this book originated with my colleague, Julie Swarstead Johnson, who is at the Poetry Center at the University of Arizona, which is one of the most important literary centers in the country. And she curated an exhibit at the Poetry Center, just small, couple of vitrines, a couple of glass, display cases of poems about spaceflight. And I didn't know that she was, an enthusiast. So we started talking, and we collaborated on this book, which spans the space age. And it includes an introduction from John Logsdon. I don't know if you know his name. He's the Dean of Spaceflight History. So that we were really honored to have him sort of introduce the history of space, especially for readers coming from the poetry world who may not know as much as we know. There's also a gallery of color imagery. Many of the poets are responding to photographs, Hubble photographs, for example. So we have a gallery in the book. And this collection could not have been published without the support of the Sloan Foundation for the Public Understanding of Science. It turns out it's very expensive to reprint poetry, which we didn't quite fully realize. And it was actually a bit of a haul to get permissions from different people. So I want to thank the Sloan Foundation. So the book, as I said, runs from the Sputnik era. The first section is Sputnik and sort of pre-Apollo, the moon landings, and then we move into the first, what I think of as sort of the first golden age of robotic exploration with Pioneer and Voyager and so forth, and the shuttle era. And then the collection ends with poems that are kind of science fictional, imagining our future, sometimes dystopian, many not, at the end of this book. So that is the arc. And the other arc that happens, and this was a surprise to Julie and myself, we're both poets as well, was to see just how skeptical poets were in the 1950s, in the 1960s. And it was a reminder that the Apollo program received majority public support only once in this country. And I think it's important for us as enthusiasts and advocates for space exploration to reckon with some of that skepticism. But what begins to happen, especially when we start to get some of those iconic images back from space, is it turns to curiosity, it turns to the sublime, it turns to delight. And by the end of the book, there are some wonderful sort of evocations of the kind of future that we've been talking about. So that is a little bit of the span of the book. Oh, one last thing to say too. We focus by necessity on North American and English poets, and I just want to put a call out for those of us who are from other nations, other language groups. There is yet to be made multiple anthologies coming from other literary traditions responding to the space age. So what we have here is, just a slender little slice. So that's a little bit of a setup. I'm going to read from the preface really quickly. This is a poem first by Walt Whitman. People know Walt Whitman from back in the day, high school literature courses? Okay, Walt Whitman. When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I, sitting, heard the astronomer where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room, how soon, unaccountable, I became tired and sick, till rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself into the mystical moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. Science can lead us to wonder. Walt Whitman, writing in the 19th century, cautions against the sterility of too much time spent with numbers alone, preferring instead contact with the night. Further reflection reveals that the diagrams, charts, proofs, and figures contain their own beauty, as they allow us to uncover the gravitational pull of unseen bodies, the boundaries of the sun's influence, the shape of a black hole. Through science, we comprehend the universe, and we can begin to venture out into it. And through translations of science into journalism, essays, and especially poetry, we venture out into imagination as well, plumbing the depths of meaning. We encounter the unearthly on those journeys, and like Whitman's speaker, we find ourselves led back to the primacy of wonder. Wonder, and particularly a childlike wonder, is one of the best characteristics of space exploration and space flight. Critics of exploration, including especially space exploration, have accused its practitioners of embodying what is called the puer aeternus archetype, Latin for the eternal child, a boy who refuses to grow up, who is figuratively and sometimes literally flighty. Embodied best in the figure of Peter Pan, this person is restless, searching, and adolescent. The implication is clear for those critics. Exploration is an ongoing childhood. It's a refusal to grow up. But we beg to differ, though some of the poets in this sweeping anthology would not. In an age when adult behavior has put the stability of civilization and the contemporary biosphere at risk, the questioning wonder of children can renew our capacity to better see the present and to imagine a better future. Industrial civilization itself seems trapped in the logic of its own undoing. So looking to space, an enterprise facilitated by industry and technology, seems both natural and maybe troubling. This anthology embraces that paradox as poets over the past 60 years have reflected on the promise and peril of spaceflight. So that's a little bit from the introduction, and I'm just going to read a portion of the Sputnik and the Race to the Moon section, and then we'll start hearing from some of the poets. So each section, Julie and I co-wrote sort of historical and cultural essays to sort of give a little bit of context. Again, we're appealing to two groups that sometimes don't overlap, like poetry readers and people who are interested in space. So we had to sort of thread the needle. So this is just a bit from the section Sputnik and the Race to the Moon. It begins with a question. When does the space age begin? Or begin to begin? With Icarus flying too close to the sun? With the Montgolfiers and the first human flights in hot air balloons over astonished crowds in France? With the Wright brothers and those who followed with the rapid development of powered flight higher and higher? Did the space age begin in the imagination of a Russian teacher named Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who foresaw rocket-propelled travel outside the atmosphere, and with the first crude mechanical rockets launched by Robert Goddard? Or did the space age begin in the imaginations of such writers as Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, each of whom sent humans to the moon in their novels? A closer source, the Nazi rocket launches during the last gasps of World War II, when Adolf Hitler ordered V-2 rockets, the first long-range ballistic missiles to be launched against England and other targets. Those missiles were manufactured and assembled by concentration camp labor, with the direct knowledge of Werner von Braun, Arthur Rudolph, and other members of the German rocket team that the US government captured to hasten American development of such vehicles. These slaves worked in an underground factory. The space age, there and then, begins in pain and darkness. But conventional wisdom says that the space age began on October 4th, 1957, when the Russians launched an artificial moon called Sputnik. And this section is a kind of documentation of that era. So we have poems about Sputnik, the first photos of the far side of the moon, first humans in space and so forth. But we'll begin with a tribute to the second Sputnik mission by Frank Piano.
My name is Frank Piano, and I'm going to be reading my poem, Laika. Laika was the first dog to be launched into low Earth orbit, and this occurred on the 3rd of November 1957 on the Russian spacecraft Sputnik 2. One of the scientists who worked to acclimate Laika was Dr. Yazdovsky, and this poem has an epigraph from one of his journals where he wrote, "Laika was quiet and charming. I wanted to do something nice for her. She had so little time left to live." Laika. Because she'd gone unbroken by 3 years on Moscow's barren streets, she'd proved her will to survive simply by surviving, and so was chosen for a kind of brute salvation. A halfway gift whose bad conclusion was already written in a lack of funds and time and the keen knowledge there'd be no way to bring her back. And so began fierce weeks of acclimation, each cage smaller than the last to accustom her to stricture tight as an overnight case, the relentless gyre of the centrifuge to mimic the weight of a cent, and crude machines to simulate the cacophonous dirge of ignition, shrieking metal, everything it would take to lift a 13-pound mongrel into history. He called her Little Curly, Little Bug, as if naming the doomed, taking her home one night to play with his 2 bright-eyed daughters could make the great burden of her approaching death a lighter thing to bend beneath when it came time to tighten the harness just once again and no more. To hold her in waiting while the riddle of malfunction was worked through its 3-day resolution, and she watched from within that aluminum tomb where she could stand or lie but never turn, and late October's chill settled its silver pall around her. 3 days and finally liftoff. Then 3 anxious hours back on Earth before they saw her heart's green tracery slow again to nearly calm, while the unshed core quietly kindled its indigo fire inside the polished dome. Listen, there is no other way to tell a thing that has no mercy in it. She burned up from the inside, fevered, frantic, blood-boiled, 600 miles between herself and solid ground. And there's no faith to be placed in the weary myth of sacrifice, no way to make right the trust that was betrayed, the muzzle and mad tongue of it. How she was thrust into weightlessness, into the useless memory of the man who spoke softly, who turned at last from the wild extravagance of the round and riveted window about which he'd been so adamant, as if she might somehow savor the breathless view, the spinning blue that beckoned like a ball tossed into a street she could only return to in flames.
So that is a hard poem. I actually started to tear up again. That's one of my favorite poems in the anthology. It's a brilliant poem, and it is difficult. But let's shift in our quick tour here of the poetic responses to the space age to a little bit more uplift. This is a poem about Apollo 8. We've heard a lot about the Earthrise photo, and this is by a poet named Elaine Emmons, about whom we could find very little, and that's one of the things we enjoyed in putting this together. There were poets, obscure poets, famous, and Elaine is just someone, we found this poem. So this is the crew of Apollo 8. Shall we call them poets for having observed on their earliest times around the moon that it seemed to be layered with a grayish white beach sand with footprints in it? Or geologists for having reported to us the 6 or 7 terraces leading down into the crater Longinus? Or shall we call them some new breed of bird for having swiftly flown weightless and unfearing and sharp-eyed into the dark unknown? Yet words to tell of their skill and valiancy are as weak as water, and their return and being earthlings with us again are what matter most. A lovely tribute to the Apollo 8 crew. By the way, do you know where Frank Borman was born? Nobody knows. He was born in Tucson. So if you have a chance, drive by Tucson High School. That's where Frank Borman started. And I just also have to say this too. You may not know, or you may know that Frank Borman actually resisted having cameras and TV equipment on the Apollo 8 mission. Did you know this? Yeah. He was proven wrong. So, and he actually tried to take credit for the Earthrise photo too. Anyway, little trivia there. So we have 2 astronauts in the anthology, Al Worden and Story Musgrave. And this is a poem of Al Worden's. I got a chance to meet him and talk with him some before his death, and he graciously gave us this poem for free. And as you may know, he published a book of poetry, sometime after the Apollo 15 mission, my favorite mission. So this is Al Worden describing the launch, and it's called Into Orbit. It's nerves. The task is here now. Stay cool. They won't know, and then it will be too late. I know I can do it. The vibration, a roar, motion, shaking, rattling. We lift straight up. Lights flash, panel moves, floating in nothingness. Then softly, softly, the motion begins again. Push up the switch. Suddenly, light everywhere. Slowly, softly, as in a dream, streaking down, trying to return too fast. Flashes again, only more gentle, relief, everything works. Is it possible? Man is a fragile thing. Didn't we realize that? Faster, faster, but only in numbers. There is no speed, no motion. Where are we? This is a mistake. Am I the only one who cares? Upside down, trying to fall off the edge of the earth? We've got to go on, compelled by God knows what, to find answers and rocks, and then nothing. Lights stop, hearts start in one monstrous moment. We are in orbit. I love that poem. So we'll move on to the robotic era. This is, we've got a couple of videos here, and the poets will introduce themselves.
Hello, my name is Donna Kane, and I am reading from Rolla, British Columbia, Canada. The poem in the anthology that's mine is called Pioneer 10, and it was inspired by a space probe of the same name launched by NASA in 1972. Its shadow has been gone since liftoff, but it took light disappearing before lonely seemed simply alone. Or if not alone, then deep in the lab of the not understood, the not taste of ourselves in its gold dust, the not soot-plumped sweat of our brows incandescent with plutonium. Shed of silver, quick, small, ideas burning off like surplus fuel. The Pioneer 10 is a thought clicked shut. Limbs drawn in, it drops like a tick from the brain's limbic core, like a photon, traveling who knows for how long before reaching a body, the way the mind needs an object, something to crack open on, and by its reflection, shine.
One of the things I like about that poem is the ending and that sort of notion that we are less than human until we encounter the things outside of us. So I want to share another poem from this section, and it's about a Mars rover, as I think you'll hear.
Hi, my name's Dan Beachy Quick, and I'm reading a poem that was written in collaboration with my friend, the wonderful poet Srikanth Reddy. And I'm reading from The Spaceship That's My Living Room. The lander turns its lens to photograph its track, stretching across the red dust back to horizon, conducts a test to see what this world lacks, corrects its own path, witness the confusion in the red dirt where the boulder's shadow leans across the path, an aesthetic sensation the machine captured by accident whose glow on the computer screen excites a human nerve to say, it's beautiful. A world absent sorrow. One must have a mind of winter to observe. No, scratch that. One must have a mind of winter to regard. The infinitesimal curve of horizon, extended off-screen, will round itself into unending. Figure 11, the word beyond stamped on a speckled egg I found in art news last winter, the remains of a bird unborn forever within. Shake it and it rattles, a child's toy. Oology, we admit, is an absurd hobby, nonetheless popular. A crossword riddle answer in the Sunday Times from a century in which we no longer live, when the cattle bird's egg displayed on the mantle, penury now but then a wealth as through a telescope quaint hobby, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and watery Saturn are each an egg in orbit's nest. Tired tropes. I tire of them, and you tire of them, whoever you are. My mind is a nothing that is hanging from a rope.
Hello, this is Kyle Dargan, recording for Beyond Earth's Edge, recording live from somewhere, Washington, D.C. And I don't know, I think about the fact that the sun is going to expand or explode often, just as a reminder to not take what happens on Earth too seriously, because it's just a fact that, one day the solar shock wave is going to undo this planet, which is not an undoing of humanity, but it is sort of an undoing of this particular terrestrial understanding of ourselves and our history. And the fact is, the hope in that, the only hope in that is space flight, right? We're going to have to be somewhere else at some point. In some ways, Earth is kind of like a womb for us, and to a degree, we don't understand space that much more than, a baby understands amniotic fluid, but we must pass through it in some way. And maybe there's just something instinctual about our seeking the stars and our seeking somewhere else to be. I hope that is the case, at least. So this poem opens with an epigraph from the now deceased Mac Miller, which is, I know the planet Earth's about to explode. Kind of hope that no one saves it. we only grow from anguish. Dear Echo, in the likely event of galactic calamity, our sun's hydrogen reserves fuse through, the star-turned red giant bloating as do our corpses. You will require flames. Between the solar shock wave and Earth's rattling, an opaque interval, you must watch. But we people prior will have left no crude fluid for ignition, for light, having tapped this rock to gorge our bellies to petroleum ache. Perhaps you will have evolved, blood supplemented with Edison and Tesla's currents, half your body fed by generators that slow cure your biomass or waste. Maybe you will be self-luminous. But if you are still, like we, like me, a mere meat pod fated to watch Mercury and Venus engulfed, surely you hold designs for an interplanetary arc. Anticipate humanity's years spent adrift in the dark liquor of space, lost within hibernation and missing Mother Planet, further estranged from all revelation of how we came to be. From this unproven vantage point, inside our history with no solid alpha, I claim to pity you and your inherited tasks, to catalog the last telluric pulse, close the case of man as now known. But beneath my softened hide, I am envious. All of our missteps as shepherds, all of the graffiti eclipsing our souls, all of it will cinder, and you will view this erasure from your Mars-bound barge. You will know the phenomenon that is judgment. See it real time as prophets allegedly witnessed. Sapiens will never have beheld a clearer beacon to be reborn.
Star Lodge. Astral Project, Indigenous Futurism, Cyberpunk Spacecraft. Moonrock Ambush, firing laser projectiles from electro bow. Robots programmed with a connection to creation, transmitting radio signals on reciprocation. This is not a second chance, but an extension cord, unbiblical. Indigenous resurgence across solar systems, traditional hunting grounds across Mercury, living off of interplanetary land, space seal hunting on Pluto, elders watching Ceres, Chiron, Lilith, curving around the sun in ovoids, recording interstellar winter solstice to spring equinox and summer to aroma of crushed leaves musty, sage and sweetgrass burning as the gas of Venus. Put down tobacco in orbit around Saturn before pulling debris away to build our wigwams. Obviously, space DNA live between Uranus and Neptune, the planetary north, and Cree sundances on Mercury, a new kind of sacrifice, and one hell of a tan. God be damned, we ain't alone out here after all. Just us long-standing hybrids, intergalactic chimeras, mixed, matched, and star silk stacked, weaved and stitched, DMB powwow drum echoes across galaxies, beating the heart of these ancient imaginations. Our bodies reflect the land, so bring me to Jupiter to see how noxious and eternal storms shape evolution. Heard buffalo across dusty orange plains, Mars, raven and coyote emerge out of Saturn to rearrange the levers, orbiting Jupiter, replacing those star stories with something fitting, our expanding breath. I can see it now. Whether the sky is blue in daytime or starshine, I continue to dream with Venus-powered heart and imagination energized by Neptune, out here, traveling.
So, for purposes of time, I'm going to read 3 more poems. There are a couple of other great poets there that we can watch later if you're interested. I want to read a poem by Diane Ackerman, and then an excerpt from a poem by the African-American poet Nikki Giovanni, whose poem We're Going to Mars is maybe the best answer to the critics of spaceflight that I was talking about. And very quickly, I'll read a brief history of the moon, and it is brief. So, thanks for bearing with me. And I hope you're hearing also the stylistic variety in this book. There's some hard stuff. Dan Beachy-Quick's poem is not an easy poem, but there are some that are also a little more readily accessible on first read. So this is Diane Ackerman. She was a finalist or a possible candidate for Journalist in Space until the Challenger explosion. And this is her elegy for Challenger. Windwalkers, how we envied you, riding a golden plume on a glitter-mad trajectory to watch Earth roll her blooming hips below and scout the shores of still unnamed seas. You were the Balboas we longed to be, all star-spangled grin, upbeat and eager, a nation's cameo. When the sun went out and you blew into your shadow, horrors clanged like falling bells. You orbit our thoughts now as last we saw you, boarding a shuttle bound out of this world, quivering with thrill, dead set but tingling, to pitch an outpost in our wilderness of doubt and climb that old ladder whose rungs lead only higher. We still dream your dream, though we taste your fire. Anybody know Diane Ackerman's work? She studied with Carl Sagan at Cornell for her first poetry thesis. She did an MFA at Cornell, and Carl Sagan tutored her for her planetary pastorals. So this is Nikki Giovanni. I'm just going to read a couple quick stanzas and then my poem, and we'll close with some questions. So this is Quilting the Black-Eyed Pea, and there's a subtitle, a much smaller, sort of font. It says, We're Going to Mars. We're going to Mars because Peary couldn't go to the North Pole without Matthew Henson, because Chicago couldn't be a city without Jean-Baptiste du Sable, because George Washington Carver and his peanut were the right partners for Booker T. It's a life-seeking thing. We're going to Mars because whatever is wrong with us will not get right. So we journey forth, carrying the same baggage, but every now and then leaving one little bitty thing behind. Maybe drop torturing hunchbacks here. Maybe drop lynching Billy Budd there. Maybe not whipping Uncle Tom to death. Maybe resisting global war. One day looking for prejudice to slip. One day looking for hatred to tumble by the wayside. We're going to Mars because it gives us a reason to change. So that's what I share with my friends who are like, why are you into space? Why are we doing this? So very quickly, my last poem. This is a brief history of the moon. I've written for the Moon Village Association for Global Moon Day on July 20th. And for those of you who were with me last night looking at the moon, I dedicate it to you. A brief history of the moon. When the moon rises, it's where you are. Light reflected from the sun shines in your eyes. Your skin beneath the moon is a long skein of stories too many here to tell. But there's a man stooped fishing beneath a banyan tree there. Shang-Yi's elixir somewhere in, perhaps, the snow-white south. They've said all that's lost on earth gathers heaped up there on what they also said was a mirror. Inanna rotting monthly on a hook, global goddess, arrowed, lonely, dark, full, and the children are singing, guard me till you die. Your heart brims with moonlight because you love and are loved, changing moods like shapes that cross the sky, and someone in a cave once etched phases on antler to keep time. we had to know. Silver falling through clear, or clouds ringed like caution against the thief. Night road, moon road, a destination reached, a village, or, metaphorically say, the moon itself, drawn down from the heavens by a telescope. Not spirit smooth, but rock. You, tonight's Galileo, can see time, collision-born, craters, mountains shocked up to snare sunlight on the night's ragged edge, dust and boulder valleys radiating from Maria just by looking. The moon is yours where you are, living magnified by this lunar span. Thank you.
This is very poignant, entertaining, and inspiring, beautiful.
I hope.
words.
Thank you.
So we will go to a quick Q&A here. Thank you, Chris. That was fantastic. You have a good reading voice as well.
Thank you.
Which is wonderful. I don't have a question. I actually want to let everyone know that Chris is working hard at bringing the first all artists and writers team into Salem.
Yeah. Yeah, look for it for next year. I need to shake some money out of a couple of deans at the University of Arizona. So. Thank you. Yeah.
We love your book. We already have it.
Oh, thank you so much.
Super love it.
Thank you.
I was curious, is there any poetry that you couldn't get the rights to use that you had to leave out?
Oh my God. Yeah. Several, but the best story is in the 1960s, most of the poets were really not particularly excited by the moon landings. But there were two poets, very public poets, Archibald MacLeish, who wrote an essay in the New York Times Congress after the Apollo 8 mission. He also wrote a poem for Apollo 11. So very sort of aspirational. So we got the MacLeish poem, beautiful poem. I recommend you read it. James Dickey was writing poems about Apollo in Life magazine. So these are poets being read in major periodicals. Millions of people are reading these poems. But we couldn't get permission from the James Dickey estate to include anything from him. So my revenge is go on YouTube, look up, I think it's ABC News coverage of Apollo 11, and you'll hear James Dickey reading the poem that I wanted to include. So, yeah. They just wouldn't let us have it. I don't know why.
I have two questions.
Yes.
One is, who are your favorite poets, or who do you follow? And second is, how did you start writing poetry? Is it because people think you're rude if you talk the facts?
Oh my gosh. I'll start with the second one. I'm trained as a journalist. I do science writing. I write for Astronomy Magazine. I'm doing that as well. But I started taking creative writing classes like maybe some of you have in college, and I just found that I really liked poetry. And so I just sort of backed into it. I mean, there was no thing that just like clicked that I would do it. So I've been writing poetry off and on for many years. And favorite poets. Yes, yeah. Well, if we can do a new edition, we missed it just by a couple of years. I think one of my favorite poets is Robinson Jeffers. He's a California poet. Very few people have heard of him, but he was a nature writer and sort of celebrating the non-human beauty and wonder of the world in ways that I think are still really resonant, given the precarious nature of things today. So, and then I fell in love with Archibald MacLeish after I reread the poem that's in this book that's about the Apollo 11 voyage. I started reading more of his poetry, and I just really love it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I love the Riders on the Earth Together line from that poem as well from MacLeish.
Yeah.
Keats once said, "The poetry of the earth is never dead." And you've traveled a lot. I checked out your website before coming to this meeting. I'm really impressed by all the things you've done, being in the Ants Med and looking for meteorites in Antarctica. You've traveled and seen the world. What are sort of the most poetic things you've seen in our Earth, just the life of our Earth, the geology of our world, that to you has inspired you in your own writing?
Wow. Thank you. That's a great question. I guess there are a couple things I would say in terms of the travels. My experience in Antarctica ended up being very difficult at the end of my time there. But there were moments when I was with a larger team, and then switched out to a smaller team. It was just 4 of us, and so I could wander off from camp, and it was overwhelming. So that has stayed with me, and it also seems like a dream. Like that wasn't me. When I traveled to Greenland with the Peregrine Fund, and I relocated meteorites that Robert Peary stole from the Inuit that are on display at the planetarium in New York City. Okay, these giant, like 30-ton iron meteorites. Robert Peary saved his career by stealing meteorites from the Inuit. Long story. But they dropped me off all day at an island by myself with a shotgun, and I was re-exploring the site, and I've never forgotten that. I had an old cassette tape recorder and taped the sounds of icebergs cracking. So that has stayed with me. But I, also I think that paying attention to where we are in any particular place is an adventure if you are paying attention. And so my home territory is Utah, and so there are places there that I just, that's where I want to lie down and die. Right? There's a trail I want to lie down and die during a snowstorm while metallarks are singing. So not right now, just when I'm older. It's like not now. Yeah. Yeah.
So I have a question, and I also have a suggestion, maybe.
Yeah.
I was curious how you solicited, because you mentioned you had poems that were more well-known, and then how did you find other people? Like, what was the process? And my suggestion, maybe for a future book, if you include global responses,
yes.
maybe poetry in other languages
yes.
and translate it, I think that would be
absolutely.
beautiful.
Yeah, no, I agree, and that's why I spoke. Yeah, I spoke to that, and we have, Pablo Neruda is in this book, but there was so much material, and then we found out how much it was going to cost to reprint these poems, and then their translation rights, and I nearly failed modern Greek in college, so I'm not really a good translator. So there is a need, and I'm really quite serious. Like, I hope all of you will take this back to your networks and your friends and your colleagues, so that we have a wider range of, a global range of poetic responses to spaceflight. And I'm sorry, how we found, so Julie, because she works at the Poetry Center, is is well-connected, understands the publishing scene, so she was great in terms of, especially contemporary poets. We scoured anthologies, there's some out-of-print work, we scoured magazines, we asked around. It was a multi-mode process to find this work. And one of the best things that we did, one of the things that I enjoyed most was reaching out to the Science Fiction Poetry Association and asking them for suggestions. So we have some science fiction poets. Kim Stanley Robinson, who is a dear friend and colleague, contributed a poem as well, and there are other sort of science fictionally oriented poems at the end of the book as well. Yeah, and then we just ran out of money.
Maybe we can do one more question if we have one, or no? Going once, going twice. Sold? All right, well, thank you
Awesome.
very much, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
That was a very